God exists, and there's three main arguments for it: the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, and the moral argument. The beginning, the design, and morality.
We'll take a building and turn it into a pile of bricks, but nature will never take a pile of bricks and turn it into a building. You need somebody to order it.
I'm Paul, you're watching Top. Let's start the show. We're talking science, so let's hear some experts. Dr. Frank Turk, crossexamine.org.
And this is the argument that many say points back to the big... Now, I know some of you who are Christians may be going, Frank, you know, we're Christians in here. We don't believe in the Big Bang. You guys don't believe in the Big Bang? I believe in the Big Bang. I just know who banged it. In fact, the evidence for the Big Bang, the creation event, is so good, you even have atheists admitting it. For example, Stephen Hawking up the road here in Cambridge puts it this way: almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. He's probably the most famous physicist in the world today. And he admits that space, time, and matter had a beginning out of nothing. Now, he tries to come up with another explanation other than God for the beginning, but he's admitting the data, that space, time, and matter had a beginning out of nothing. His explanation for how we got here is in his book, The Grand Design. I don't know if you've seen that book. It's about 5 years old. And on page 181, he says this: because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing. To which John Lennox, who I mentioned last night, said, when nonsense is spoken by brilliant scientists, it's still nonsense. A law like gravity creating the universe out of nothing? What's he talking about? First of all, there was no law of gravity. There was nothing. No space, no matter, no time. Non-being. What is nothing? Aristotle had a good definition of nothing. He said, nothing is what rocks dream about. That's nothing. There was no law of gravity. And even if there was a law of gravity, gravity doesn't create anything. Gravity just does the same thing over and over again. Once there's a material world, then gravity will describe what happens to certain bodies. But it doesn't, it's not a creative force. So Hawking is grasping for something other than God, but he's admitting the data that space, time, and matter had a beginning out of nothing. Now, another cosmologist by the name of Alexander Vilenkin. By the way, a cosmologist is not somebody that puts on your makeup, okay? A cosmologist is somebody that studies the origin of the universe. He's a Russian cosmologist who is an agnostic on the question of God. He doesn't know whether God exists or not, but here's what he said in his book, Many Worlds in One. He said, with the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is now no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. In fact, 4 or 5 years ago, when Stephen Hawking had his 70th birthday party, Alexander Vilenkin went to visit him, and at the birthday party, Vilenkin gave a paper where he talked about the beginning of the universe. I guess these scientists, in order to have fun, give papers at birthday parties, right? So he read this paper that he wrote about how all the evidence that we have right now points to the fact that the universe had a beginning. Again, he's an agnostic, but he's saying, look, it had a beginning. Now, Vilenkin is actually a believer in what's called the multiverse. Have you heard of the multiverse? That there are many universes out there, and our universe just appears to be designed even though it really isn't, because just by the luck of the draw, we happen to have a universe with these kinds of characteristics about it, and that's why we're here. But even Vilenkin said, even if there are other universes out there, and by the way, there's no evidence there are other universes out there. There's no way to detect these other universes. But he says, look, even if there are other universes out there, all of them together would still need a beginning. So it would seem to me that if it still needs a beginning, you still need a beginner, right? Now, what is the evidence that's having these scientists and virtually all scientists saying the universe had a beginning? Well, here's the scientific evidence, and I have it in an acronym, SURGE, S-U-R-G-E. This will help you remember why we know the universe had a beginning. This is the scientific evidence. There's philosophical evidence we'll look at as well. And I'll just list what each of these letters stand for here, and then we'll spend just a few minutes on each one of them to show you why these scientists are saying the universe had a beginning. The S stands for the second law of thermodynamics. The U stands for the fact that the universe is expanding, and you'll see why that implies a beginning here in a few minutes. The R stands for the radiation afterglow. which actually is the remnant heat from the initial Big Bang explosion. We'll look at that in a few minutes. The G stands for great galaxy seeds. We'll get to that. Hang on. And E stands for Einstein's theory of general relativity. So these scientific reasons are why scientists are saying, look, the universe had a beginning. So let's look at each one of these in order. We'll start with the second law. And the second law of thermodynamics says that the universe is running down. It's running out of usable energy. As time goes on, the amount of hydrogen atoms in that sun are burning up. Ultimately, that sun is going to burn out, and we're all going to go to heat death. Don't worry, apparently it's several billion or million years from now. But one day that sun is going to burn up. Okay, big deal. What does that mean? How does that show the universe had a beginning? Well, think about it this way. Think of the universe as a dying flashlight. If we were to take a flashlight right now and turn it on and put it here on the podium and leave and come back tomorrow, what would the strength of the beam coming out of the flashlight be tomorrow? Probably be a lot weaker, right? Because there's only so much juice in those batteries, and the longer you have it on, the less and less energy you're going to have, right? Well, suppose I had turned the flashlight on an infinitely long time ago, if you could. Would there be any light coming out of it today? No, it would have used up all its energy. Well, think about the universe as having batteries, like a flashlight. If you turned the universe on an infinitely long time ago, there'd be no energy left. The sun would be dead. We wouldn't have any heat. We wouldn't have any energy right now. But since the sun is still burning, that would mean that the universe had a beginning, that it didn't have an infinite past, that at some point somebody created it and now it's burning down. Everyone with me on this? Now, the second law of thermodynamics is also what's called the law of entropy or disorder, that things tend to go to disorder with time. We know this because this building, which was built in 1848, you notice we've had to do a few upgrades here since 1848, right? That nature runs things down. It runs things toward disorder. You see, nature will take a building and turn it into a pile of bricks, but nature will never take a pile of bricks and turn it into a building. You need somebody to order it. Things go to disorder. We learn as we get older. The second law of thermodynamics affects us because when you get older, you get dresser disease. That's when your chest falls into your drawers. You know that? That's what happens. We run down. Everything's running down. Well, if everything's running down, somebody must have wound it up in the beginning. And if the universe was infinite, we would have all run down a long time ago, but we haven't completely run down. So the universe had a beginning. This second law of thermodynamics is one of the most fundamental rules of all science, or laws of all science. In fact, this is sort of a closed area of inquiry in science. Nobody investigates whether or not you can make, say, a perpetual motion machine. Because we all know the second law of thermodynamics seems to be absolute, that things run down. So, we know the universe had a beginning from the second law of thermodynamics. The U in surge stands for the fact that the universe is expanding. Anyone know who this guy is right here in the corner? That is Edwin Hubble from the famed Hubble Space Telescope. He has a telescope named after him now. Before the telescope was named after him, he was using this telescope at the Mount Wilson Observatory in Pasadena, California in 1929 to observe the galaxies out there. And Hubble, when he looked out at these galaxies, noticed that they were all moving away from us, that the entire universe appeared to be expanding. How did he know this? When he looked at the galaxies, the light from the galaxies was red, which showed that the galaxies were receding from us. They're all moving away. And Hubble deduced that if they're doing this now, if the universe is doing this, yesterday the universe was here. Yesterday, the day before that, it was here, before here. And he went all the way back in time until he realized that the entire universe came from a single point. A single point of nothing. There was no space, there was no matter, there was no time, and then the universe expanded from that point. In fact, he deduced this. He said if the universe, or if time were reversed, the universe would have collapsed back to nothing. So there was no space, matter, or time in the beginning, according to Hubble. Now, Hubble, back in, I guess, 1929, he thought it was neat to have your picture taken with a pipe. You notice that? I don't know why he's got a pipe in his mouth, but they just thought it was neat back then. And this expanding universe got Hubble to think, well, it must have had a beginning then. Now, for many years, scientists thought, well, if it had a beginning, it probably had a beginning in a great explosion. But they thought there should be some remnant heat from that explosion still out there, but nobody bothered to look for the heat until two scientists discovered it by accident in 1965 at Bell Labs in Homedale, New Jersey, and that leads us to R, the radiation afterglow. This is Robert Wilson and Arno Penzias, and they discovered the remnant heat from the initial Big Bang explosion. This is literally the smoking gun to the Big Bang. There's heat still out there from the initial explosion. It's just a couple of degrees above absolute zero, but these guys discovered it in 1965, and they won Nobel Prizes for it in 1978. It would be like this. Suppose you're cooking cookies in your oven, and you open the oven, you take the cookies out. There's still heat coming out of the oven, right? Well, there's still heat coming off the universe right now from the initial explosion. And these gentlemen discovered it. And one agnostic astronomer by the name of Robert Jastrow said that when this discovery was made, this put the nail in the coffin of the last doubting Thomas who thought the universe was eternal. Because scientists 100 years ago thought the universe was eternal. It didn't have a beginning. But after they started making these discoveries, by 1965, they said, look, this theory, which was called the steady state theory, that the universe was eternal, this theory can no longer be believed after we've discovered the smoking gun to the Big Bang.
My name is Gerald Schroeder. I have a, thank God, a strong science background from MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, bachelor's, master's, PhD, 7 years in the physics staff, seen a whole range of atomic bombs detonated, moved to Israel, met my wife, Barbara Sofer, a great writer, and then teach Torah and science. So luckily, I'm lucky that I have the two that come together. And one of the questions that I'm asked as a scientist is, how can a scientist really believe that there's something that we refer to usually as God? You know, is this metaphysical whatever acting in the world or producing the world? The irony is, the question's really a non-starter. Science has in fact discovered God. And you can talk to the hardline atheists and they will say, it looks like science has indeed discovered God. And how would that be? Well, if you take the trouble of going to the web and there type in WMAP, the initials for a satellite, it's a diagram that shows the development of the universe from the creation over time. It's a timeline. Every word on that diagram comes from the NASA site. It is the condensed knowledge of the scientific community of how the universe created and how it got to where we are today. Each of the lines, the vertical lines, is another billion years. Okay, you start from a burst of energy at the extreme left side of the diagram, and you end up at the far end with the oval. The oval is to indicate expansion in all directions. Of course, because it's a timeline, we can't show that on a single piece of paper. We see here, most amazingly, that on the extreme left edge, it shows a beginning to the universe. Now go back less than 50 years. If I were teaching that at Tech, a person could lose tenure saying that there was a creation of the universe. It sounds like it's Bible, because less than 50 years ago, the overwhelming scientific opinion was the universe is eternal. There was never a beginning. The Bible is wrong from the very first sentence. And then we discovered, suddenly, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson, the Bell Labs in New Jersey, the northeast of the US, discovered the echo of the Big Bang, the energy left over, which George Gamow, 60 years ago, predicted that if there had been a universe created hot and small, it would have exploded, and the energy would get more and more dilute. And Penzias and Wilson, these Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson, discover this energy that had been predicted overnight. The Bible got it right. There was a beginning to the universe. Now, the black in the diagram is nothing. It's not a vacuum. Vacuums are within that diagram, within that cone of expansion. Black vacuums are empty space, and space is something. The black of the paper around the diagram is nothing. It doesn't fit in our human brain, because humans think in a box made of time, space, and matter/energy. No human, as clever as they might be, as expansive as they might be, thinks out of that box. So when we say outside that diagram is nothing, we can use the words, but we can't conceive of nothing. It doesn't fit in the human brain. How are we going to have this idea, is there a God or not? Notice that the creation force isn't the three-letter word G-O-D. If you look at the words carefully, it's a quantum fluctuations. That understanding was first brought down by Ed Tryon brilliant human being, in the journal Nature, almost 40 years ago. The universe allows creation of something from nothing, provided you have the laws of nature, quantum fluctuation. Darwin realized, and he published in the journal Nature, one of the 2 leading peer-reviewed journals in the world, that you can create something from absolute nothing, provided you've got the laws of nature, quantum physics and the laws of relativity. In other words, the laws of nature. So look what science has discovered. We can create the universe from absolute nothing, provided we have the forces of nature. Now, the laws of nature, the forces of nature aren't physical, they act on the physical. So if they create the universe, that means they predate the universe. So now we have a set of forces, we call them the laws of nature, that are not physical, that are able to act on the physical. They create the physical from absolute nothing. And they predate the universe, which means they predate our understanding of time. Put that together, it sounds very familiar. If you haven't noticed it, that's the biblical definition of God.
The last doubting Thomas has been convinced that the universe isn't eternal, it actually had a beginning. Now, scientists thought that if the universe did have a beginning, that there should be some temperature variations in what's called the radiation afterglow. And this acronym here, COBE, COBE, stands for Cosmic Background Explorer. It's a satellite. They tried to discover temperature variations in that radiation afterglow. They couldn't discover them from the Earth. They were going to have to put a satellite up to do so. And they were going to put the satellite up on the space shuttle, the United States Space Shuttle, so they could look at these temperature variations. But in 1986, the Challenger space shuttle exploded off the launching pad, and the space shuttle program was canceled for a while. So they actually put the satellite up on a rocket in 1989, and they put it up into orbit, and it circled the Earth for 3 years, measuring the temperature variations in the radiation afterglow, the remnant heat from the initial Big Bang explosion. And finally, by 1992, they had enough measurements to draw a conclusion. And this is the G, called the Great Galaxy Seeds in our evidence here. And what they discovered were temperature variations that were so precise, down to 1 part in 100,000. And according to the theory, these temperature variations allowed the galaxies to form in the early universe. And this was discovered, as I said, in 1992. They won Nobel Prizes for discovering this in 2006. In fact, the man who really headed the expedition was a man by the name of George Smoot. Here he is. And he taught at UCal Berkeley. And he wrote a book called Wrinkles in Time. And Stephen Hawking, look at his endorsement right on the cover of the book. He said, "The scientific discovery of the century, if not all time." Now, that may have been a bit of an overstatement. But the point here is that these temperature variations that they predicted, they actually found, and they were so precise, they were down to 1 part in 100,000. If those temperature variations were any different, according to them, there'd be no galaxies now. So they discovered these very fine temperature variations. And George Smoot won a Nobel Prize for discovering this, okay? Now, the E in Surge stands for Einstein. And Einstein knew that the universe had a beginning as far back as 1916, when he came up with general relativity theory. He realized that if his general relativity theory was correct, that time, space, and matter are correlative. They came into existence together. He knew this, but he didn't like it. Einstein wanted the universe to be eternal. He wanted a steady state universe. So the great Einstein decided to put a fudge factor into his equations to allow the universe to be static and eternal. He wanted a counterforce to gravity. He didn't want this, because that would imply a beginning. He wanted this, a steady universe. So he put a fudge factor into his equations to keep the universe static and eternal. And some say that the great Einstein, in order to do this, divided by 0. Now, what are you told in grammar school? You never divide by 0. You can go straight to hell for that, right? Never divide by zero. Well, the great Einstein divided by zero, and mathematicians in the 1920s were looking at his equations going, Dr. Einstein, you can't divide by zero. Then, in 1929, Hubble discovers the expanding universe, which is what Einstein's theory of general relativity predicted 13 years earlier. So at one point, Hubble, after he discovers the expanding universe predicted by general relativity, he calls Einstein up and he says, Dr. Einstein, what you predicted 13 years ago, I'm actually seeing in my telescope. Why don't you come out to Mount Wilson here in Pasadena, California, and you can see the expanding universe for yourself. So in 1931, Einstein went out to California and he looked through Hubble's telescope. In fact, who's that right behind him? That's Hubble. You see the pipe right there? Einstein's looking through the telescope, he sees the expanding universe, and at a point later, after he got off the telescope, he said to the news media, he said, I now see the necessity for a beginning. The universe did have a beginning, and he said the cosmological constant, the fudge factor that he put into his equations, was his greatest mistake of his professional career. Now, it turned out that Einstein was actually right. There is a cosmological constant, but it wasn't the value that he had. The cosmological constant is now known as dark energy or dark matter that is actually accelerating the expansion of the universe right now. Did you know that the universe is accelerating in its expansion? The universe is expanding, and it's expanding at an accelerating rate, which makes us wonder, if the universe is expanding, why is it still so hard to find a parking spot here in London, right? You ever notice that? But yes, it's expanding at an accelerated rate, and we don't know why. We call it dark energy or dark matter, and that dark energy is fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 160th power. We'll talk about fine-tuning here in a minute, but there's only 10 to the 80 atoms in the entire universe, and this is fine-tuned to 1 to the 160th power. It's a mind-boggling number. You can't even get your head around it. And what the scientists are saying is if that expansion, if that acceleration rate, that cosmological constant they call it, if it were any different, we wouldn't be here. In any event, the universe had a beginning. And Einstein, if he were here today, would say, look, it had a beginning no matter what you say, okay? So this leads us all to this guy, Robert Jastrow, who I mentioned earlier was an agnostic astronomer. In other words, he didn't know whether God existed or not. In fact, he said in 1978, well, he actually wrote a book called God and the Astronomers, and he updated this book in 1992. He went through the evidence we just did, we had gone through to that point, the surge evidence. And on page 1 of the book, this guy worked for NASA, by the way. On page 1 of his book, he says, I'm an agnostic on religious matters. In fact, he said, look, I don't know whether God exists or not, but on page 14 of the book, here's what he said. Again, the book's called God and the Astronomers. He said, the astronomical evidence leads to a biblical view of the origin of the world. The essential element in the astronomical and biblical accounts of Genesis is the same. Then he went on in an interview to say this, and this is, by the way, this is an actual picture of Saturn from the Hubble Space Telescope. That's not a painting. That's Saturn in infrared. Here's what Jastrow, the agnostic astronomer, said in an interview. He said, astronomers now found they painted themselves into a corner because they have proven by their own methods that the world began abruptly in an act of creation to which you can trace the seeds of every star, every planet, every living thing in this cosmos and on the earth, and they have found that all this has happened as a product of forces they cannot hope to discover. That there are what I or anyone would call supernatural forces at work is now, I think, a scientifically proven fact. Now, wait a minute. Wait. Why would an agnostic astronomer say it's scientifically proven that supernatural forces are at work? Why couldn't nature have created the universe? Why couldn't nature have created the universe? Anyone? There was no nature. Nature had a beginning. In fact, I was at another event at the University of Michigan a few years back, and during the Q&A, an atheist got up to the microphone after I'd gone through this evidence, and he said, if you give science enough time, we're going to figure out a natural cause for the universe. And I said to him, John, that sounds a lot like faith. Right? That's what it is. Science hasn't found it yet, so just give science more time, have faith, and we're gonna find it, right? Why will we never find a natural cause for the universe if the evidence that we have now is correct? Why will we never find a natural cause? Because nature itself was created, so nature can't be the cause. Nature is what the effect is. So if nature had a beginning, whatever created nature must be beyond nature. In other words, must be supernatural. That's what we mean by the word super, right? It means beyond. In fact, I said to John that night, I said, John, you're saying that if you just give me more time, I'll figure out a natural cause for all of nature. That would be like me saying, if you give me more time, one day I'll figure out I gave birth to my own mother, right? There's no way that's conceivably possible. It's impossible in principle. If space, matter, and time had a beginning, whatever created space, matter, and time can't be made of space, matter, and time, right? In other words, the cause must transcend space, matter, and time. The cause must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful to create the universe out of nothing, personal in order to choose to create, because only persons can make choices, and someone had to choose to create. As I mentioned earlier, gravity can't choose to create anything. Gravity just does the same thing over and over again, right? I mean, gravity isn't sitting there going, look, if Turk drops that remote one more time, I'm not going to pull it to the ground, right? No, gravity just does the same thing over and over again. In order to create something, you got to be a person. You got to have a personhood. Also, the being must be intelligent, because as we'll see here in a couple minutes, the universe is designed, it's fine-tuned. Now, when you think about a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent cause, who do you think of? That's what we mean by God. Now, it wasn't just Jastrow who said these kind of things. Every one of these scientists I'm about to quote here have won Nobel Prizes for discovering some of the surge evidence. They're not Christians. They're just people who are following the evidence where it leads. Arno Penzias said this: the best data we have concerning the Big Bang are exactly what I would have predicted had I had nothing to go on but the 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole. His colleague, Robert Wilson, who discovered the radiation afterglow, said, certainly there was something that set it all off. I can't think of a better theory of the origin of the universe to match Genesis. George Smoot, the guy who taught at UCal Berkeley, said this: there is no doubt that a parallel exists between the Big Bang as an event and the Christian notion of creation from nothing.
I want to leave with this question. Okay, the evidence leaves us with one of the 2 following questions. Either no one created something out of nothing, or someone created something out of nothing. No one created something out of nothing, that's the atheistic view. And then someone created something out of nothing is the theistic view. Okay, which do you think is more reasonable? If I tell you, hey, please create a pen for me right now. If I wait long enough, according to your theory, if I wait long enough, a pen will appear in my hands. With no materials provided, with no forces acting on it, with nothing. So if I just stay there long enough, somehow a pen will appear. Which is more logical? That view, or that someone must have created something out of nothing? Somebody must have created the material, somebody must have created the laws of nature in order to make the universe that we live in a possibility. I'm Paul. Let's reach the top. See you next time.